In October 1962, the world came closer to annihilation than at any other moment in human history, and most people never even realized how close it truly was. Not when the headlines calmed, not when the speeches ended, because the most dangerous moment didn't happen in public. It happened in silence, deep beneath the ocean, when a single man made a decision that could have erased the future. At the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union stood as two giants locked in a battle that had no battlefield, no declared war, no official beginning, just a slow, suffocating tension that spread across continents, shaping governments, wars, and the lives of billions. It was a conflict fought through influence, fear, and the constant threat of nuclear destruction. A war where the ultimate weapon could never be used, and yet was always ready. After the Second World War, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Europe lay weakened, exhausted by years of devastation. In its place rose two superpowers, each with its own vision of the future. One driven by capitalism and democratic ideals, the other by communism and centralized control. Both believed they were right. Both believed the other was a threat that could not be ignored. But beneath the surface of ideology, something more dangerous was growing. Fear. Not just of each other's weapons, but of intentions. Misinterpretations became risks, silence became suspicion, and every move, no matter how small, carried the potential to spiral into catastrophe. By the early 1960s, this tension had reached a boiling point. The Soviet Union, seeking to rebalance the strategic disadvantage it faced, made a bold and secretive decision. Nuclear missiles would be placed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States mainland, close enough to strike major cities in minutes, close enough to change everything. The operation was carried out in absolute secrecy. Equipment moved undercover, soldiers deployed quietly, missiles assembled piece by piece. On the surface, Cuba appeared calm, but beneath that calm, a line was being crossed, one that could not easily be undone. The United States discovered the truth through reconnaissance flights, grainy photographs, strange shapes in the Cuban landscape. Analysts studied every detail, and then came the realization. These were not defensive installations. These were nuclear launch sites. What followed was not immediate war, but something far more dangerous. A pause, a moment where decisions had to be made carefully, under immense pressure, with incomplete information. The US administration faced a choice: do nothing and risk vulnerability, strike and risk escalation, or attempt a blockade and hope the Soviets would back down. The decision was made to impose a naval quarantine around Cuba. It was a word chosen carefully, not blockade, because blockade meant war, and war was exactly what both sides claimed they wanted to avoid. As American ships moved into position, Soviet vessels continued their approach. Each mile closer tightened the tension, each hour increased the stakes. The world watched, but only saw part of the story. What they didn't see were the layers beneath, the private messages, the miscommunications, the fear inside the decision rooms. And then the moment came. Soviet ships nearing the blockade line slowed, and then stopped. Some turned back. For a brief second, it seemed like the crisis might diffuse, but that was only the surface. Because beneath the ocean, unseen and undetected, something else was unfolding. A Soviet submarine cut off from communication, surrounded by American naval forces, began to experience rising pressure, literally and psychologically. The crew had been underwater for days. Temperatures were rising, oxygen levels dropping. They could hear explosions, warning charges dropped by US ships attempting to force them to surface. But the crew didn't know they were warnings. To them, it sounded like war had already begun. Inside that submarine was a nuclear torpedo, a weapon capable of devastating an entire fleet,
a weapon that, if launched, would almost certainly trigger a full-scale nuclear response. Protocol required agreement from 3 officers to fire. 2 of them agreed. They believed war had already started. They believed they were under attack. They believed launching was not just justified, but necessary. The 3rd officer hesitated. In that moment, history balanced on a single decision, not made by presidents, not by generals, but by a man in a metal tube, cut off from the world, forced to interpret chaos with limited information. He refused. Against pressure, against fear, against what seemed like a logical response, he refused. And because of that refusal, the torpedo was never launched. The chain reaction never began. The world continued, unaware of how close it had come to ending. Above the surface, negotiations continued. Messages passed between leaders, some public, some secret. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba. The United States would quietly agree to remove its own missiles from Turkey and promise not to invade the island. To the world, it looked like a political resolution, a tense but controlled de-escalation. But the truth was far more fragile. Because the crisis wasn't just about missiles, it was about perception, about how easily assumptions could lead to irreversible consequences, about how systems designed for defense could, under pressure, become triggers for destruction. In the aftermath, both sides began to understand the true danger they had faced, not just the enemy, but the structure of the conflict itself. Communication channels were improved, direct lines established, protocols reconsidered. But the Cold War did not end there. It continued for decades, through proxy wars, through espionage, through technological competition, each side pushing forward, but always carrying the memory, spoken or unspoken, of how close they had come. The Soviet Union would eventually collapse, the United States would emerge as the dominant global power, and the Cold War would be declared over. But the lessons remain. Because what nearly triggered World War III was not a single decision. It was a system built on mistrust, a world divided into opposing forces, each convinced of its own necessity, each interpreting the other through fear. And perhaps the most unsettling part of this story is how little it took to prevent disaster. Not a grand strategy, not a perfect plan, just hesitation, just doubt. Just one person choosing not to act. History celebrates decisive action, the leaders who move boldly, the moments that define eras. But sometimes the most important decision is the one not made. The missile not launched, the order not given, the line not crossed. Because in a world armed with unimaginable power, restraint becomes the rarest form of strength. And as long as that power still exists, the question remains, if that moment came again, would we make the same choice? Or would history take a different path? If you enjoy stories that reveal the hidden moments that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe, because sometimes the most important events in history are the ones that almost happened.